Hey guys, welcome to our next installment here in American History Lectures. And today we're going to take a look at the next part of our progressive era, talk more about the politics side of it, not so much the social side. So how are all the social reformers kind of changing politics in DC? We'll take a look at some of the progressive era presidents and what reforms they made while they were in office. So just to kind of bridge the gap between last unit and this unit, remember we talked about how there was kind of a bit of a corruption issue occurring in different forms of government, whether at the local, state, or national levels of government. There was a perception that the large business owners had too much sway over the federal government and state governments in order to protect business interests. And there's a lot of different versions of corruption with the big political machines as well as those that we saw at like Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed and so forth in New York City and Chicago. So there's going to be a clamor for change and trying to get rid of this corruption in politics. So even during the Gilded Age, there was a call for reform. The first case of this is going to be in 1883 when the Pendleton Act is going to be created as a way to try to create merit-based exams to really kind of get rid of that idea of the spoil system that we've talked about multiple times, all the way going back to Andrew Jackson. And it was a way to kind of make sure that people were not just getting jobs because of people that they knew, that it was a way to kind of make a merit-based program for federal level jobs. City governments, especially local governments, would try to also kind of get rid of these political machines, like we talked about Tammany Hall in New York City, by trying to branch power out by creating city commissioners and city managers and having city councils and so forth as a way to try to delegate power on a larger scale or to more people to make it less likely for the corruption to occur. And instead of having power in the hands of one or two, by having power in many. Progressive reformers are going to work to impact state governments as well, and they're going to try to regulate railroads. We talked about during the Gilded Age that kind of under the Vanderbilt Railroad near monopoly, there was not a whole lot of regulation, that they could really kind of charge and do things whatever they wanted to. So there's going to be a push to try to regulate workers, regulate businesses, and try to promote as much competition and what was considered fair practices as much as possible. And from this, we're going to see a lot of different state governments that are going to outlaw child work, limiting the hours that women and children were able to work in a week. And a lot of this is going to try to limit the restrictions and try to improve the rights of workers. A lot of that, which was being pushed upon by the labor unions of the AFL and the Knights of Labor that we talked about in the Gilded Age. So Robert La Follette is going to be one of the first ones and kind of the groundbreakers in the progressive era. He was definitely a progressive era governor of Wisconsin. He pushes a lot of the same populist slash progressive ideas and policies that were put in place during this time period. They're the first state to create a state income tax. They were the first ones to really kind of adopt regulations on big businesses and who could do certain laws and regulations to restrict what businesses can and cannot do, and also adopt industrial commissions to basically kind of regulate the businesses and make sure they're not becoming unfair and creating problems in the marketplace. And these politicians are going to kind of team with these what we'll say quote unquote experts from academia in Wisconsin to create these state laws, again, the things like the income tax and regulations on businesses. And Wisconsin is going to, from there on out, is going to become a model for progressive reforms in other states and also on the federal level. One of these ways that we're going to see reforms take place on state levels before we get to the federal level is going to be on the idea of making states more democratic versus Republican styles of government, where we've already kind of mentioned during the Gilded Age this idea, this push to get senators directly elected under the 17th Amendment. We'll talk about that again here, but different examples of this could be initiatives, and we see this even today. So when you guys become 18, you're able to start voting. Usually when you have elections, there will be some sort of initiative or some sort of referendum on the ballot where you directly vote for legislation. So it kind of bypasses the state legislatures and allows the people to vote directly on a certain issue. And this would be an example of direct democracy. So that's one of the things that progressives will try to push for more so than what we had seen in the past. Another example of this could be recalls. Recalls could be called for a number of reasons, and what the major reason for this would be an idea to remove an elected official. So we could see an example of this in Wisconsin a few years ago with a recall on Governor Scott Walker to try to change the results of an election. during this time too that we're going to see the primary elections changing and how they are done, and moving into the current model, what we see today, where we have primary elections to allow voters to choose party candidates rather than the representatives of each party allowed to choose. So we see this all the time. It's a process that takes over a year when we're moving into a presidential election. In 2015, we had the primary system go through and elected Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump for their respective parties. Here's an example from 2012 where you can see the state of South Carolina, who voted to elect Newt Gingrich as the delegate from their state. And you can see down here in the bottom, Gingrich had 40% of the vote compared to Romney with 28%, and then all the way down the ticket. And you can see it broken down by the counties as well as who won each county. Now, what that essentially means is that those delegates, those 23 votes towards the party candidacy, will go towards Gingrich. Now, eventually in 2012, Mitt Romney will win, but this is just one example of that state. So you can see kind of the process here where you have delegates competing, and you might have more than two. You almost always have more than two, and they're going to compete to win the primary. And then once they win the primary, we get to the general election in November where you have the major Republican candidate versus the Democrat candidate, and then you would have eventually your winner, either Republican or Democrat candidate. So by 1913, the 17th Amendment will be passed where it allows senators to be directly elected by the people. And before this, we've talked about this briefly, before this it was done by the state legislatures. And I like this graph because you can see the differences of kind of how each office gets elected. So you can see the role of the people, who the people vote for. We vote for state legislatures, we vote for the House of Representatives, we vote for presidential electors, and that this would eventually be the Electoral College, who votes for the president and the Senate both pick the Supreme Court. Well, now there's a direct bypass. Before the 17th Amendment, the Senate was picked by state legislatures. They would elect two people to go on behalf of the state to Washington. However, with the 17th Amendment, that bypasses and gets rid of this system and takes the people directly to the U.S. Senate. So essentially, you are voting for both the House and the U.S. Senate. So let's go ahead and get now into how are these progressive reforms impacting politics on the presidential scale. So let's start with our story in 1901. Republican candidate William McKinley is going to be assassinated at the World's Fair, and what that means is that Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. At the time, the youngest person to become president, was a very popular amongst the people, was seen kind of as a progressive Republican. And this is what really kind of starts the idea of the progressive era, this idea that Theodore Roosevelt held, which was that the government should be responsible for the welfare of the people. Before this, what we've seen, and we see this in politics today, depending on which party you support, should the government do more for people, or should people do more, have more personal responsibility? And Theodore Roosevelt is going to use what he calls the bully pulpit to really kind of push his reforms, because they're not always the most popular. They're popular amongst the people, but not always most popular amongst other parties in the legislative branch. In 1902, one of his first big legislations that he's going to help to work on is what's called the Square Deal, which was a kind of a compromise between coal miners and management, who had been labor unions who had been striking against management in the coal mines, and it was a way to kind of bridge that gap between the two and find some sort of negotiation or middle ground between. And keep in mind that during the Gilded Age, laissez-faire policies were the bulk of the norm. Whether we're talking about Grover Cleveland or Benjamin Harrison, all of those Gilded Age presidents were very hands-off, and it allowed for businesses to kind of operate how they saw fit. This is not going to be the case during the Progressive era. It's going to be the exact opposite. Progressive era presidents, whether Republican or Democrat, are both going to try to push forward regulation on businesses and really get rid of the laissez-faire system of practice. So both the ICC and the Sherman Antitrust Act are going to be used to kind of restrict and regulate trade, regulate railroads, but neither was really used to control monopolies at this point. We talked about how certain companies had close to near monopolies, whether it would be Standard Oil or Carnegie Steel or Vanderbilt's railroads, but there's no real kind of regulation on these sorts of practices. And Roosevelt is going to be the first president to really kind of change this. He's going to become known what's called the Trust Buster, and you can see this here in the political cartoon, kind of showing him wrestling or taking on, fighting the railroads, or here in this one where he is almost David against all these different Goliaths, the major corporations of their time period. And he's going to use the Sherman Trust Act to break up different security companies or different mega trusts to get rid of these what were near monopolies and break them up into separate smaller companies. And he's going to bust 25 different monopolies during his presidency, and not so much against monopolies, but wanted to control the bad trusts, the ones that he thought were hurting the consumer, the ones that were price gouging, or the ones that were doing unharmful business practices in his view. So it's more kind of a case-by-case basis. And in 1906, he's going to create consumer safety laws where we're going to get the FDA out of this when Upton Sinclair writes a book called The Jungle, outlining the horrible things that were happening in meatpacking plants. And when this book is written and it's kind of brought to the public, it's going to be cause for concern as to what people are ingesting. And again, with Theodore Roosevelt believing that the government should protect the people or should do more to help the people, he's going to, with that, create certain acts like the Meat Inspection Act and eventually the FDA to regulate what food is being put out to the public. And what this Food and Drug Act will do is not only just end harmful business practices as far as what's going in the products, but also end false medical claims. So by law, companies cannot falsely advertise things that their products will do for you. So this was very common at this time. Swindlers or people who were trying to deceive people would push forward medicines that had no impact or had negative impacts, and they pushed them as far as things that would cure all sorts of things, whether it be cancer, tuberculosis, or any other diseases that they might have. This is going to be put to an end with the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. One of the other major pushes that Theodore Roosevelt will have during his time period is the idea of conservation, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. During the Gilded Age, corporations clear-cut forests and exploited natural resources, and we can see this here in the lumber industry, this clamoring and this using up of natural resources, and it's going to be seen as kind of a problem in some eyes as far as what to do with these natural parks. And Roosevelt will be the first one to create an environmental program to protect acres of land that were seen as national parks or forests. So these lands were then considered owned by the federal government. They could not be taken, they could not be bought, they could not be sold, they could not be used for their resources. They were basically hands off to those. So you cannot drill for oil, you cannot cut down lumber, you cannot drill for coal, or mine for coal, or drill for gas. None of these things were able to be done in these areas. Biggest thing to keep in mind with Teddy Roosevelt's presidency as a progressive is his concerns are consumer protection, control of corporations, and conservation, and he's going to use the federal government to try to create all three of these things. And again, this is a completely different shift from that of the Gilded Age, where it was more laissez-faire, hands-off, smaller government. This is an explosion of what the federal government's power was used for. Some will see it in a positive light, some will see it in a negative light. Again, we would maybe be able to see the idea that we talked about with Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson, strict versus loose construction of the Constitution. Does the federal government have these powers, express them in the Constitution, depending on how you view it? Yes or no. So even though Theodore Roosevelt was very popular amongst his time period, he decided to not run for a third term, and he's going to actually hand off the presidency to his vice president, William Taft. Remember, Roosevelt will do a lot to kind of change the role of what government is, as far as government having responsibility, the ability for its citizens, the idea to regulate businesses, protect the environment. His foreign policy, we mentioned this in the first lesson with imperialism, was that it was meant to protect. America should be a police force for the weaker or the smaller countries and keep them from being obscured or being overtaken by that of European powers. So when Roosevelt does not run for a third term, William Howard Taft will win the presidency to continue his progressive agenda. Taft was just as much, if not more so, a progressive than Theodore Roosevelt, especially when it came to busting trusts. So as president, Taft will push for progressive reforms again. He will get rid of trusts, just like Roosevelt. He will establish the Children's Bureau, Department of Labor. They will create child labor laws to basically get rid of child labor altogether, not just minimize their hours, but also just get rid of it outright, and create safety reforms and so forth for coal miners and railroad workers. But however, as much as a progressive as Taft was, there were times economically where he sided more with the other half of the Republican Party that was non-progressive. And one of those things is going to be on tariffs. And he's going to support tariffs. Now, the progressives do not want tariffs. And Theodore Roosevelt himself will be very angry at this and will actually challenge Taft on this publicly because he does not support the tariff. He does not want to help. He does not support a tax to help large corporations. So as a result of this, Teddy Roosevelt is going to run for president again in 1912, but he will not be picked as a Republican candidate. Taft will, and Theodore Roosevelt will say, fine, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make my own party. I'm going to make the Progressive Party, or what he calls the Bull Moose Party, because his famous quote is, I'm feeling as fit as a bull moose. And because of this, it's going to split the Republican Party vote. So you will essentially have 1912 being a three-way race between the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, Republican William Howard Taft, and progressive Teddy Roosevelt. You can see that as a result of splitting the vote electorally, it will allow for Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency very, very easy in 1912, and he'll become the next president as a Democrat progressive.